I'm Ruby, and this is the Beautiful Podcast. Difficult placements in our birth charts are empty containers, vessels which once held diamonds. The truth of these aspects have been littered with shame, guilt, and the like. This is why the Beautiful Podcast seeks to uncover the mysteries and hidden jewels that have remained buried for far too long. Each aspect is a shining jewel in our apron that with some care can be seen and realized. Our guest today is Sabina, an evolutionary astrologer and intuitive soul guide. She specializes in helping souls navigate spiritual awakenings and those who identify as being highly sensitive people through chart readings. Her style helps you recognize your wholeness and integrate your karmic lessons. You can find Sabina at soulspurposecoaching.com, and she's also active on Facebook and Instagram.
I think it's vulnerable. I think it's vulnerable, but it's also part of, it's cathartic for me in the fact that I just get to continually embrace sharing who I am in the rawness, in the beauty, in the pain, in the reality, in the realness of the human experience. And it takes practice to have it feel innate. Even though it is innate, we're so conditioned to be certain ways and to ignore a lot of our innateness, intuitiveness, authenticity in order to be loved, to please other people, to be part of a group that may not be in alignment with our highest truth. And it's a continual practice for me in sharing my authenticity with people, because for years it was hidden. You'll see by the Scorpio stellium, Scorpio, 12th house, 8th house is very private. It's very isolating in a lot of ways. There are a lot of secrets maybe that we keep from ourselves. There are a lot of secrets that show up as isolation or I think, anyway. So I think I just want to share that it is a continual practice to share the evolution of one's authenticity, and that it's never static. It continually evolves. So what I believed and maybe interviewed 2 years ago may be very different in some respect, in some facet, to who I was then, because now it's a different time and it's now, and I'm not living in the past, and I'm doing my best to not live in the future, which is a constant practice. But being very present in who I am in this moment, which is not perfect because that is an illusion. And it feels a really opportune time to have this interview with you during the dissolution of the Pisces new moon, right? And all the Piscean energy, which is the dissolution of the old identities and the old materialism and old objects and structures that are not who we are in this present moment. And so I, like everyone, is in a place of release, deep release, and clearing the way, clearing the space for where I get to evolve into my highest identity, or my high, and I say identity not as in something to glom onto or to attach to, but to continually evolve. And you can't really sink your claws into something that's continually moving, right?
So Sabina, a way that I really like to start off these sort of interviews is to look up the person's name, just because it tells us so much about who the soul is. So I looked up your name, and Sabina is found in many cultures all over the world. In ancient Egypt, Sa means radiating light. And in ancient Hebrew, Binah means understanding. So to me, that means like you're an understanding, radiating light. You're a wise light who shares that light with everyone around you. And I just experienced that. So, it feels like it's on par. It also means cat-like, and you have these cats.
I
Um,
have ancient Egyptian cats, actually. They're Abyssinian cats that are the original prototype of the ancient Egyptian cat. So, what a wonderful interpretation of my name that I was not privy to. I do privately, which is not on my page, I do soul code readings as well, which is the vibration of the sound of one's name and its interpretation. And in my experience with that, I have not come across this interpretation. It's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, when I heard that, I just thought like, oh, that feels right. Um, it also means, or it's also about these like, there was this society, this culture that lived in the Apennine Mountains in Italy. And so that's probably one you came across, right? And those women, the people of that culture, they were revered as symbols of honesty and wisdom. And then, of course, in the German culture, which I think you're a part of,
That's where my name the origin comes from, my German family. Yeah.
aha, okay. And that means strength, resilience, and independence. Okay. So that's perfect. So welcome.
Thank you.
So in your journey with this aspect, of all the virtues, which virtue or virtues had a big effect on shaping you into the soul I see before me today?
First, before I go into that aspect, I would say it's the stellium, sun, moon, Venus, and Mars. No, sorry, not Mars, Mercury in Scorpio in the 12th house. And also, I'm also rising in Scorpio. So many years ago, when I was 19, and in multiple other countries, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And it became my identity in my early youth. And I was very disparaged by the idea that I couldn't change anything in my reality, that I was kind of cursed with uh, this label. And astrology is something that I've studied for 35 years, and it gave me a different lens to look through to really connect with the innateness of myself without the conditioning or interjection of anybody else's opinions or ideals or analysis of who they thought I was and how I was supposed to be. So it's that most pure compass rose of the origin point of who I am. And in that, understanding the Scorpio frequency was so blatant with that stellium, that I had to perceive myself as how to move through the depth of that frequency, which in Scorpio is death and rebirth, right? It is the death rebirth process that is continual. In alchemy, it is the dragon eating its tail. It is,
Mm.
um, I recently came up with another word that I had run across the word creatrix the other day in reading um, an alchemy book that I can't remember who wrote it, but I was like, I'm a regeneratrix is really who I am. And that I feel to my core that when I go through the death process, a dying of the ego, a death of circumstances that are no longer in alignment of who I am, um, that I can now rely on there being a rebirth. And when I was pathologized with the bipolar disorder, it found like an impending doom. It felt like a impending death that I would not recirculate from. I would not regenerate from. It just felt like an anchor that I had to live with. And I think energetically, we all die and rebirth ourselves in new relations through new relationships as mirrors, through our evolution, through our maturity, through our circumstances, through careers that where we may change trajectory. um and in each one of those for me has felt like a physical death. It's felt like I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel when I'm in it. But yet, at age 52, I've been through the death and rebirth process enough to know that I can rely on a rebirth as long as I've committed to living with both feet in my reality. And there's a lot of strength that I've found in that Scorpio stellium that early on felt much like a curse or a blanket that I couldn't pull off over my head. And it's really a gift that I keep uncovering. I keep uncovering gifts because I have the perception that as an evolving soul, through that death and rebirth cycle, it might not be comfortable. It might feel like impending death. That's painful. It's a painful process. But I now can count on there being light balancing out that shadow of that Scorpio stellium. So Mercury, how I think, how I imagine, how I process in the 12th house. The 12th house is ruled by Neptune and it is an ominous space, lack of boundaries. It is infinite potential. It is the dream realm. It is astral travel. It is also known in the material world as isolation, loneliness, and it's indefinable, undefinable. I'm not sure which is the correct word, but and in that it feels ominous, like you can't tack down an identity or a structure that helps secure your safety. Does that?
Quick question.
Yeah.
Um, would you say that this feeling of this very intense feeling of maybe either fear of death or I guess embracing death, would you say that's a very Scorpio thing specifically, or is it like a Scorpio stellium thing more so? Mm,
I think it's a Scorpio frequency. It's a pure Scorpio frequency to have the death and rebirth process. If if we're looking at our chart with 9 planets, which are 9 spheres of our wholeness, to have 2 luminaries and 3 other planets in Scorpio is a pretty saturated experience of that Scorpio frequency. So yes, it's definitely saturated. It's and there have been many times in my life where I didn't think I could make good with it, that it was going to be the end of my story because I couldn't find my way through number one, all of those placements in the 12th house. Looking back, um, looking back at my chart, which I understand so much more now at age 52 than I did when I was 19, right? It's a lot of years of study and understanding in different modalities to come to make peace with who I am in the present moment. And the mercurial placement of Scorpio in the 12th house, the Venusian placement of Scorpio in the 12th house So Venus is my relatability and my values. So death and rebirth, I can't tell you how many times I have just walked away and let things die, kind of hands off. Scorpios have the Scorpio archetype has a reputation for being very black and white.
Mhm.
And I don't think of it so much as black and white, though yes, I can easily be seduced into black and white thinking, but it's a commitment. It's the scorpionic frequency is like this commitment of 2 feet in or 2 feet out. And so, yes, that might translate or transpose to a black and white frequency, but it's more about a commitment to riding through the cycle. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Like it actually reminds me a lot of what you were saying at the beginning with folk working on not being in the past and working on not being in the future, just wanting to commit to the present. That kind of reminds me of what you just said, that commitment to the here, the now. And
Yeah.
then when you're in the black space, okay. When you're in the white space, okay. But it's never both at the same time.
It it can't be. And I think when you have, or not you, but when I have had a foot in either space, I'm taken out of the present and I'm very clear that I can't wholeheartedly commit to my human experience if I have a foot in either camp. It has to be in if I'm going through the death process, I'm gonna have 2 feet in my death process. If I'm gonna be in the glory and the brilliance of the other side of the rebirth of that death process, I'm gonna have 2 feet in there, and that I can't exist with 1 foot in either camp. Does that make sense?
I mean, theoretically, I have like two planets in Cancer. So for me, I mean, at the same time, I've got Moon square Pluto, Sun square Pluto. So I definitely have a lot of that kind of energy. It's
Yeah.
tinging everything, but my comfort space is very much the opposite of what you just described, which I think is
Ah,
why I find you so fascinating because
okay.
it's so.
We can you share it a little bit? Just not that this interview is about you, but that I would love to understand the mirror of your perception of the opposite of that space.
Ah, okay. Um, huh. Okay, so the comfort, uh, for me, it's Venus and Mars in Cancer. The comfort of not having expectations, the comfort of not having to commit. Um, Again, I recognize why commitment is very, very important in all these things, but and it's funny, it comes back to our masking conversation.
Yeah.
Um, I've done a lot of hiding, and whenever you speak to anyone who's interested in astrology, we're very unique people, Uranus, right? Um, and so, I find that the way I think, the way I naturally want to communicate with people, it's very different from how most people may want me to go about it. I don't mean to
Where
be,
where does your Uranus where does what house does Uranus sit in your chart?
it's in the 11th house in
So is
Aquarius.
mine.
Really?
Oh, no, mine's in Libra, but my Uranus is in the 11th house, and I also that's very relatable. That's very relatable for me. So Uranus can, under the age of 35, or under the age before the first Saturn return, can really represent where we're alienated in our social network.
Mm,
And as we mature past that first Saturn return, 30, um, the age of 30, 32, it becomes what makes us unique enough to really individuate.
mm,
But because we're still developing our ego and our sense of self under the age of 30, we're really accumulating our knowledge. Then we spend the rest of our life disentangling all of that knowledge, right?
mm,
And that's the removal of the mask and being able to own the weirdness of that Uranian archetype.
Mm.
And I so understand that. I've so experienced the same thing.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so that's just that wanting to be safe and comfortable. And so putting on a mask when interacting with people, so much so. Actually, I watched this video with Jim Carrey, and I also related to the way he spoke about it.
Mhm.
Um, in a lot of his career, he would put on a sort of face for the public to be successful in whatever way he felt he could as a comedian, actor, etc. But he did it so much that Jim Carrey, like actual Jim Carrey, got lost. And so for him, it was kind of like, well, if Jim Carrey could get lost so easily, was there ever a Jim Carrey? Like, was that ever even who I am? Um, and when I was watching,
I identify with that so well. I moved a lot as a child. My mother was a bit of a gypsy, very bohemian, and I was in 16 different schools before I graduated high school. And
I
so
was in 10.
in each year, I was introduced to a new group of friends, and it became very much a chameleon-esque lifestyle to just shift my person or my persona, perceived persona at that time, to what would help me feel secure in a group of friends in a social setting. And I remember my mother saying to me, "You just have to learn to be yourself." And I'm like, I have no, like, I didn't understand what that truly meant until maybe after she passed away. And she was really the stepping stone for me in a spiritual awakening or a death and rebirth process of who I actually was, and going through that Jim Carrey experience of, did I ever really know who I was? Who am I? you know, you
Yeah.
know, and that I think it's a natural, when you're going through it and you're kind of rejecting everything that you had perceived as safety or as a structure that stabilized you in a really human world. I call it, embodying your earth suit. It's not a stable, solid experience. It's very mutable. It's very shifty. And it has to be in order for us to evolve. If it were very stable, we wouldn't grow. We would just be very mundane and the same, and there wouldn't be any evolutionary progress for the soul. And if the soul is an infinite energy, I don't want that. And so, as uncomfortable as change could be every year in school, which then I didn't understand, but now I've made peace with that past because of diving so deeply into my birth chart and to others' birth charts, that there's peacemaking with parts of myself that I really alienated, didn't understand, didn't want to integrate um, in my chart. And the visual of looking at a birth chart is like, oh, there is my wholeness in being in its most innate state without any kind of opinion, interjection, analysis, or opinion of anybody else of who I am. And that's where I have to learn how to love all those parts of myself. And I think that's really why I chose to use that in my coaching practice, was because when people are really discontented with their reality, they might project it onto their external circumstances, but the only way to shift it is really to hone in on one's innate self. And so that was a starting point for me in really understanding, accepting, and learning to love all the parts of me, which is still an evolutionary process. I have not honed making peace with every single aspect of myself. And based on the sensitivity of an HSP that I identify with, all of my senses are very sensitive. My smell, my sight, hearing for me is anything too loud, and oh, I just check out or I have to check out.
So, in your experience working with a variety of people with similar energies to the 12th house, the stellium, Scorpio, what lesson does someone who has these aspects have to understand about themselves? Like in terms of patterns, what are you seeing?
I think inner trust, self-trust. Self-trust is the glue for me in my personal process. And without self-trust, you cannot really live your essence in its purest authenticity because it's still caged by external conditioning, whether it's opinion or um, culture, you know, uh,
Mm.
parental guidance that is not in alignment with what feels good for you, which, after you're grown out of your relationship at 20 with your parents, there's then the individuation of self-ownership. And in the self-ownership, you have to be able to trust yourself in order to activate what you believe is your authentic frequency. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. Um, Authentic frequency. That's really, really wonderful. So then, in terms of your own life story, what did that individuation process kind of look like? Especially because you were saying that at 19 you were diagnosed. So it sounds like maybe a lot of things were happening at that kind of turn of age moment. Um, so if you could,
Yeah.
yeah, walk us through
Um, okay. So I had moved to a foreign country at that time. I was 2 years out of the United States. I'm from California originally. I had moved to London the fall of 1989 to get to know my father better. And I lived with him in London and I was going to college there. And then he was transferred to Egypt. Um, and I had the choice to go back to the United States or to stay in London. And I chose to stay in London because it was like my eyes were just wide open with its multicultural access. I could reach 100 different countries in under a couple of hours as opposed to living in California, on the West Coast. I had family in Germany that I was close to that I could get to know a little bit better. There were just all these opportunities of cultural and spiritual growth that had my eyes wide open. And so I was scared to commit to that, but I didn't really want to go back to California at that time in my life. But yet I was isolated. I had my mother. I was 17 and a half, well, almost 18. So 18. And I um, was alone living in a city of 14 million people after my dad was transferred to Egypt, and I made a lot of mistakes, and I tried a lot of things. I was in that experimental phase where I was trying things that nobody could tell me no about,
that.
and so, yeah, I tried a lot of things that were unsafe but I'm of the ilk that you can tell me what is right or wrong for me morally or otherwise, and I'm gonna have to just find out for myself. So you
Mm,
can tell me that. And that's just how I'm built. I think that's a little bit of, I have Sagittarius, my Jupiter is in Sagittarius in the first house. So it's kind of a part of my identity. That first house is the primal self. And not that Sagittarian is necessarily a rebellious energy, but my Mars in Aquarius is very rebellious in the third house of communication. And that Sagittarian kind of bohemian, international, curious outlook of multicultural perception, I was just thirsty for. I just had a huge thirst for that. So I stayed there. but I didn't have a support network, right? My dad was in Egypt, my mom was in California, and I didn't have a structure of friends. Living in Europe was very different to make friends. The European trajectory for making friends is very slow compared to Americans and Australians and New World culture in how I experienced it. It may not be the same for everyone, but it was very slow to curate and to get solid. It wasn't like you meet somebody at the pub, you have a couple of drinks with them, and all of a sudden you're best friends and you hook up together for the next 2 or 3 years going to do things, which is very American and Australian in style, at least in my observation of living in a European country. And in England, it's much slower. It's much more of a mask of slow, intentional observation before anybody activates anything. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, that does.
And
Um,
so the answer to your question is I didn't have a supportive structure there, and I was very isolated on my own. I'm an only child, number one, so I didn't have siblings at that time. I didn't have a social structure of safety to anchor me in any way, and I was very much living in that infinite space of the 12th house in my reality that I was very unanchored. And unfortunately, it created a circumstance for me where I had psychosis. I experienced psychosis due to a lack of sleep and an intake of substances, which, you know, were part of my experimental phase, and it didn't serve me well. I um I think I fractured, you know. I had a psychotic break. It was my first experience with r- mental illness that I couldn't shift. You know, I struggled with depression a little bit as a hormonal teenager and always felt a little bit isolated because I was an only child and I did a lot of things on my own. I still do. But now I don't feel victimized by it. Now I'm like, I have to encourage myself to go out of my house because I enjoy my own company so much. And even now, that Scorpio stellium, I experience my emotions and my feelings with such depth. You know, oh gosh, I want the iPhone, or I want the $500 shoes, or you know, whatever it is. It's really kind of a youth thing, but then some people never grow out of that materialism because it will isolate them in their perception.
mm,
And for me, I like nice things, but it is no longer uh, part of my persona because I'm enough. Like, and that was a lot of the growth process was in owning the depth of my person and of my authenticity and understanding how it alienated me from other people that were not in alignment with me. And I still experience that currently. There are people that I meet that I can have really great intellectual conversations with, but then I will always take it a little bit deeper and they get uncomfortable and they will either walk away, I won't hear from them again, or they will project something that, you know, shows their discomfort to me. And I understand how to read it now. I've been given some life skills through the last 10 years, particularly of navigating life in my own frequency and not in the life that I knew with my mother in it. And it became that became really the catalyst for me in having to learn who I was without my mother in my life. She was kind of my everything. She was my best friend, she was my travel partner, she was my shenanigans partner. She wholeheartedly loved me in all of my bad mistakes and awfulness, and I really panicked when she left. You know, she crossed over in 2013, And that was really the catalyst of me having to stand in my own shoes and not be attached to her. She was a very magnetic and exuberant and social animal. And at that time in my life, I thought I was an extrovert, which absolutely isn't true. I'm an introvert. I'm an extroverted introvert. I'm an ambivert when I'm with people that love my depth. That's when I'm an extrovert. But other than that, I'm an introvert, and I'm good with that. I don't feel like that it's rejection or that it alienates me in any way. But that's also very 12th house. It's also very Scorpio, is that we keep ourselves to ourselves. And in reaction to that, there was a big period of my life where I over-explained myself to people because I wanted to be understood. And 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 I don't have to do that anymore. And that's liberation. That's liberation in owning the depth and not having to have the expectations that people will like me or won't like me. I don't have that attachment so much, you know?
When did that start for you? When did you even start to see that you didn't have to, people didn't have to like you? Like, when did that even dawn on you?
I think my last relationship,
Hmm.
I think my last relationship that was pre-COVID or pre the pandemic, we'll say, in that was really another level of awakening for me, where I gave up in one day. I kicked him out of my house. I gave up alcohol. I gave up psychotropic medication that I had thought was keeping me stable emotionally, mentally. And all on the same day, I let all three of them go. I made the choice that I no longer wanted to be, I wanted something so different for myself that I made a very bold change. And, it was multifaceted. It wasn't just one thing that changed the trajectory. And what that did for me was, after a horrible purging process of all of it, I started receiving information that I had been numb to for a lot of my life while I was on that medication and while I was imbibing on alcohol. It numbed my awareness on multiple levels, and that's also very Scorpio. So any of the water signs, right, are incredibly intuitive, and the 12th house, the 8th house are particularly intuitive or psychic. So if I'm looking at somebody's chart, I'm looking at the 12th house. Oftentimes the first house, like a Pisces moon in the first house, will be incredibly intuitive and psychic awareness. Now, not everybody with those placements are awake to their psychic abilities or their intuitive abilities, because we've been conditioned to only rely on the logical mind. And so, though we all have that innateness of the intuitive intelligence, it's not a muscle that's been strengthened. And so, mm, I help people in my work tap into that intelligence, and it's not to disregard logic. We need both. But if we're not using both intelligences, we're handicapped in some way. So why not strengthen both intelligences along the way?
This feels so vulnerable, though. Um, that's
What
I'm
what feels vulnerable?
like everything that you were sharing. It just feels like so vulnerable. Um, like what you were saying, because going back to the Cancer, the Mars, Venus, and Cancer. Um, I take right now. I take a lot of support from these sort of boundaries that I've set up in my life that are
Mhm.
fake, false, not so good boundaries to have. And I know that they're not very good for me. And I know that they kind of keep a lot of my intuitive gifts at
Mhm.
bay. And it's a bit of a trade off that I'm doing right now. So I tell myself I want to be more intuitive, but I like having this boundary here because I don't like the vulnerability that comes with what it sounds like you were speaking about.
Yeah, and I think it is vulnerable. It comes God, I used to feel so deeply about what people thought of me. God, what will people think of me? And it wasn't until I made peace with that and gave the energy back to them in their discomfort of who I am that I could truly be open to the receptivity of my own intuition. Like they all, everything's interconnected. All the energies and intelligences are interconnected, and you have to release some things to receive the other. And there's a kind of a trade-off. And it's allowing yourself to know that you're safe within your own boundaries, but still receptive enough to be able to be open to communication on a different plane, right? And and it's individual for everybody. You can't just go enter a course for 9 weeks in intuitive development. You have to move through your own energetics and your own boundaries to hone that and to own it. And it's not easy. And some people give up because they go back to the structures that they were once comforted by, even though they are not optimal for that authentic frequency that we were talking about.
What kept you from going back when you made that decision to purge everything?
The pain was too great to go back. The pain that kept me unhealthy and unhappy and in toxic swimming in uh how do I want to say that? What kept me from loving myself, all of that was too painful to go back to. Once I discovered tastes of what it felt like to truly love myself and own who I am in all my weirdness and authenticity, I didn't want to go back. And it's not just a one and done process. You don't just step into the next reality and bam, you're done. It's a it's an integration, right? It's an integration which is kind of like the timeline shifts, right? That I talk about. I I like the idea of timelines, but I don't like it for a perception perspective because it removes it removes you from the the now experience as opposed to going somewhere else out of your human earth suit. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, it probably does, but for whatever reason, I'm not picking it up.
Okay, well, you can edit this part out if it doesn't. um but think I think it's an integration, and it's a choice. I don't allow myself to slip back. I have 2023 was not a comfortable year for me. It was a very deep year of a lot of integration and acceptance about a number of aspects in my life that I couldn't change and that I had to put to rest. And it was a very uncomfortable and painful year, but I had to process it and make peace with it and accept it. I remember somebody asking me what was my word for 2023, and it wasn't until the last day of the year on the 31st of December that I'm like, "Oh, my word for the year is acceptance." Because I finally accepted. I fought against that current of the introspection and the acceptance of where I was for most of the year because I felt I had done so much work in creating the pathway to forward momentum, but that wasn't the truth. And so, where I may have had a really wonderful forward trajectory for 2021, 22, and the first part of 2023, much of 2023 for me was another big introspective space for me to dissolve what didn't have room to go with me in my next forward trajectory, which is my present now. So, so I think there's a myth that people that work in, I don't know, astrology or intuition, that they have all their ducks in a row. And that's so not, I don't want to say that that's not true. I think we have the perception of where the work needs to be done in our own life, but life happens to life happens, I don't want to say to all of us, it happens for all of us, but we can feel victimized by certain events in our lives. And I'm no different than anybody else in that capacity. The whole victim consciousness, yeah, we don't want to be victims in our own lives, but there are circumstances in our lives where we have felt very victimized, and that isn't to be ignored or isn't to be shoved under the carpet. It's valuable fodder for how you grow through that and move into the forward momentum based on that past experience. Does that make sense?
I think my head and my heart are feeling quite conflicted and heavy because what you're saying is something, that is true, that I'm wanting to move through. Can we talk about acceptance,
Sure.
which we're doing, but
Yeah.
yeah, acceptance. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind, can we so how long were you in this situation where, the psychotropic drugs and that whole sort of time or point
It
moment?
wasn't just one timeline. So, being diagnosed with bipolar disorder from 19 through my 40s, uh, I went off and on medication probably 6 or 7 times where I'd have periods where I didn't want, because the side effects of those psychotropic medications are horrific. You gain weight, you have dry mouth, you have other functions that don't function. There are a lot of but for my reality at that time, I believe that they gave me a stability that I couldn't find for myself, and that I needed that foundation. And I don't, where I wholeheartedly believe in getting to the bottom of the bottom. If medication stabilizes you and keeps you safe from harming yourself or others, then utilize that. It's there to be utilized and not shamed, because I used it for multiple times in my life where I couldn't find that stability within myself. But when I finally shed it, um, a few years ago, I knew I was done. I knew I was strong enough in my own resilience and my own frequency that I didn't need to go back. And
So
that was part of that. So I would say, in answering your question, there were probably 6 periods in my life between the age of 19 and 43 that I was off medication for a year or 2, and then went back on medication because I needed the stability that I couldn't find for myself at that point in my own reality. And what was the rest of the question?
acceptance.
Oh, and so, yeah, I mean, sometimes the pain was too great to negotiate life with feeling as raw as I was feeling. And I've been diagnosed in 3 different countries with bipolar disorder. And so that became very much an identity that I just had to accept about myself. And how do you accept that reality with that diagnosis if you are not a self-governing individual, but you are allowing yourself to be um pathologized from outside of yourself. And I just got to a place, and it doesn't make it wrong, it just makes it not where I am today. And that for me, the evolution was that I actually had the power to navigate what I needed to navigate in order to find some kind of homeostasis for myself. It's not that I don't um, feel the effects of chemical, neurotransmitters doing certain things in my head, because it is a pattern for me. And it's usually based on the moon phases, new moon and full moon definitely elevate a sense of excitement and lack of sleep for me that can escalate into 3 days without sleep. But I monitor it in a way, and I have enough experience with it in a way now that I know how to handle it in the best possible way without medication.
So what you're sharing,
Yeah,
um, this is making me think about karma.
yeah.
Um, I think a lot of the times when we think about karma, we, I'm not saying you, I'm saying the
Mhm.
royal we,
Yeah,
we think that karma
the
has to be
collective.
something, yeah, something negative when it's just actions. So there's good karmas and, or not even good, but there's just actions. It's a variety of actions.
Yeah.
And so as you're speaking, I'm just thinking about, time spent, um, when we're in patterns, like you were saying, that identity, that label about those three diagnoses,
Mhm.
there are, we sort of choose, decide, naturally move in a way for a period of time. And then it's interesting because, and it's very Scorpio of your journey, that it's one thing for like 20 years, and then almost like lightning strikes, it becomes something completely different. And so in terms of karma, in terms of the pattern of actions that you had been performing in these two areas of life, like what was that transition? Um, how did your actions in your everyday life change to empower that shift?
I got sick of my own shit.
That's all it took. That's all it took.
Like, I got sick of being sick. I got sick. Yeah. I got sick enough of where I was that wasn't changing, and the only variable was me making a change. And I had to do something pretty dramatic because on multiple occasions in my life, very scorpionic and, managing darkness and depression, I there are multiple times in my life I wanted out, and I didn't want to be living this human experience. And in order for me to not go back to that old ideation, I had to make a really different choice that I'd never made before. And for me, that was releasing. And it'll be different for everybody. I'm not saying, don't enjoy a glass of wine if you handle it well. I'm a better person without alcohol in my life. I have more clarity, I have more discernment, I can hold my energetic boundaries. But if I drink, I can't do any of those efficiently. And I love myself enough. It's the same with psychotropic meds. And you mix the two, and then you really have a cocktail of not being able to own yourself. And if you can't own yourself, you can't trust yourself. And if you can't trust yourself, you can't grow.
Let's talk about self-governance. That was a beautiful word that you used. What does self-governance mean to you, and how do you use it practically in your life?
Um, I think sovereignty, so inner sovereignty or self-governance, is the ownership of who I am because I know who I am, not because of external conditioning. And and there's a strength in that. There's a strength in knowing who you are without anybody else's interjection that grounds you. You're like, I know who I am. And I always laugh because people that are interested on the periphery of astrology, they're like, "Well, I know who I am. I don't need to look at my birth chart." Okay, that's okay. You don't have to. But there are other people that might be 50 or 60 and they're going through a lot of turmoil in their life and they have to get back to ground zero to know who they are or remember who they are or even uncover who they are that they didn't know about themselves. That's where that natal chart is that purest essence of that. And I just can't feel more of a useful tool in that. It is the moment you were born, in the place that you were born at the longitude and latitude, with the planets in very specific locations that create the archetypal persona of you, good, bad, and indifferent, that is that origin point of really know thyself. And without knowing thyself, I was watching, do you ever follow Robert Grant?
No.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah, he's incredibly intelligent. He's a mathematician by trade, but he had a reel this morning that basically said, the eye without a mirror can't see itself, a knife can't cut itself, and without the external objectivity and observation of somebody else helping you perceive your consciousness, you can't get an unbiased view of your consciousness. And that really makes a lot of sense to me in the work that I do and in my own work with myself, that I reach out to people that I really value their perception, not as a guru, but as another eye to see what I'm not seeing. Because I, like anybody else, get really stuck at times. And I'm like, what am I not seeing? Why am I stuck here in whatever the trajectory is at that moment? Um, and I been disappointed by people that I have pedestalized because I thought, oh, they know way more than I do. Yeah, I've been disappointed, but that's also been part of my journey, is not to pedestalize people. And that again is that sovereignty. That's that self-governing where you don't give somebody outside yourself the power to know who you are.
um, I follow a practice, and it's all about self-sovereignty. It's about, I am the soul. I'm seated in the center of the forehead, just a point of light. And I've got my faculties, I've got my mind, my intellect, my subconscious. They're my ministers. They help me govern the body, the actions. And, I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years, and there have been incredible changes to my personality from who I was before and who I am now. But as you know, I haven't hit my Saturn return yet. I don't have very much life experience in this lifetime. Um, and so I always find it so fascinating because I feel fortunate in that I've received quite a lot of knowledge, but I don't have a lot of experience, and I don't remember a lot of experience from other lifetimes. And
Yeah.
so it's like this weird, awkward space between self-sovereignty, being a
Yep.
detached observer, and
Yep.
then, yeah, so.
Yeah. Um, I think life experience is one of the most enriching experiences for me was living in different countries outside of my own culture, because it was a different perception. It was a different perception of the collective that I knew. Now I grew up, going to different countries in the summer to visit my dad because he was German, and I spent time with my German family, and he lived in different countries and I visited those. So I had that gift of a different perception. Uh, does that give me opportunities that other people don't have? Yes. but they, it's all a trade-off. Everybody is kind of balanced in the same way because they receive different things that I uh didn't have. And I have been, had the finger pointed at me that I was very entitled, or that I was given opportunities. And I don't see it as that. I don't see that in that way at all. I see that, yes, it was a gift that I got that different perception of foreign culture for me to see how the rest of the world lives, and expands my view of perception. And that was a phenomenal gift that I would never want to give back. Um, so I'm very grateful for that. But not even but, it's life experience is, I've done a lot of different things. I've been everything from a jockey to a horse trainer to a phlebotomist to a pet nutritionist, and now I'm an evolutionary astrologer and intuitive life coach. And we're in a time where, the previous generation before Generation X, they were very privy to having one job their entire life and being supported by a corporation that gave them a stability that none of us know. Generation X, millennials, Gen Z, we don't have that level of security or stability. We haven't experienced that. And so it's a new way of being, to be adaptable and malleable without losing yourself. And so going back to the the
Brand?
Jim Carrey. I was like, who's John Kerry? Wait, I had to check in a second. Going back to the Jim Carrey experience, which many of us have experienced, of we lose ourselves in the crowd. We lose ourselves in the collective because we don't hone that inner sovereignty, because we don't know what that is. We don't know that it's an option for us to own who we are and cultivate who we want to be. That's releasing the power of the external and taking that inner sovereignty and that inner guidance and that inner governance, that you have that. It doesn't mean that it's not without pain. It just means self-ownership, and then self-acceptance and self-trust. That's what that means.
I'm kind of curious, are there any connections between that stability foundation and horse jockeying? Like, did that kind of help with that? Was it more of, what was it for you in terms of expression?
Well, early on, I had an early astrology reading in my life, that really identified that Sagittarian Jupiter and Sagittarius. I have Jupiter and Neptune in Sagittarius in the first house, which is a big part of my persona. And they were very literal in saying, well, that Sagittarian frequency in the Jupiter is your horse obsession. And I was obsessed with horses from the age of 2, and it was everything. I eat, slept, and breathed horses for 44 years. And then when my mom passed away, that kind of dissolved. It's like, and I had a lot of guilt about applying so much effort and uh dedication to that one thing that now was changing. And so, I mean, yes, I was a jockey, but I also showed horses, hunters and jumpers for a long time, and I started young horses under saddle that hadn't been ridden. So a lot of different facets in within that industry. But yeah, I worked in the horse racing industry for 10 years. And did that offer me stability? No, not so much. But the stability for me was, the horses were a stabilizing security for me growing up, where everything else changed around me when I changed to a new school, but the one constant were my horses. Wherever I moved, I got to take my horses with me, and I spent multiple hours at the stables because that was what was stable, and that's what felt safe for me in all of the having to readapt to new environments.
So, can I ask what brought you back to California? You were sharing that you spent a lot of your life away. Mm.
Yeah, I lived a year in New Zealand. I lived 9 years in London, and I lived a year in Italy, year and a half in Italy. And then I spent, long summers in France and in Germany because of family. And so coming back to California was my decision living in London to pursue horse racing as a career. I took a number of years off when I lived in London due to physical injury, and because both my parents really wanted me to get a college education and not do horses for a living. And so I did. I took that time off, but I rode a lot when I was in England because it's a very horse-centric society. And I took the opportunity to do that. Well, I was engaged to a man that was from Newmarket in England. Um, and his family lived on the Gallops in Newmarket, and we would go to his parents' house on the weekends from London and watch the horses gallop. And it absolutely reawakened my zest for horses. And I decided that when I left London because of life circumstances and finances, I needed to come back to California. And if I was going to pursue a life in horse racing, it wasn't going to be at 4 o'clock in the morning in freezing cold English weather. It was going to be in California or where I could find a job.
Can you speak about one memory from maybe adolescence that you associate with your 12th house stellium in Scorpio?
Yeah, one that I wouldn't say it's traditional, but it is definitely a very personal lesson for me. In the secret keeping of Scorpio, through throughout my life, I have had people come to me because of a safety they felt in sharing their secrets with me. And it's just kind of an intuitive awareness that people have, whether they're conscious of it or not. Um, because I kept a lot of secrets as a child. I was very secretive. My mother thought I was a really good, well-behaved child until I moved away and told her I wasn't. Uh, and what I mean by that is I was very quiet. I moved very quietly about what was not going to be really accepted. And and I was sneaky. I was sneaky in that. And with that came a lot of guilt and shame. And what I have learned through learning boundaries, most of my life I didn't know what a boundary was. I I had my perceptions of what boundaries were, but it wasn't until my mom passed away we didn't have boundaries with each other. We were very enmeshed, we were very connected, and it wasn't always a good thing because she was very demonstrative in how she thought I should do certain things, and I didn't know how to set a boundary that was loving with her. I just shut her out. And for me, I didn't understand the difference between walls and boundaries. And so this has to do with that secret keeping, and that as I've grown, I have really released myself from being the person that wanted private secret friendships because it carried a lot of weight that wasn't always good. It wasn't always um comfortable. And when I was very transparent with people that I had had very, not necessarily sexually intimate relationships with that were private, but friendships where they were nobody else knew about them. And it was just like this one and one association. And it was like, oh, don't tell such and such that I'm friends with you. and and I got to a place in my life where it didn't serve me and in fact enraged me. And I no longer accepted that level of friendship on that secret format of that scorpionic frequency that is very secretive. It's very intimate, it's very secretive.
Mm.
I'm intimate in with the people that I want to be intimate with in that engagement. Um, but I no longer am open to people just dumping their secrets on me and asking me to hold them. And
Mm.
it's a boundaries thing, and I have to tell you, the biggest lesson for that is how liberating it was when I was able to identify and live that, activate that boundary.
This is interesting what you say about boundaries. When I think about Scorpio, even when you use that word weight, so with horse jockeys, I was doing a little bit of digging, and it seems like there's a very specific weight that people have to keep in order to be able to perform, I suppose.
Yeah,
Um,
so you have to weigh in. So
mhm.
each horse race, say that there are 9 races on a card for the day at the horse races. Between each race, you have to weigh in your weight because you would need to make weight for horses that are being handicapped in the racing form, because it's a handicapping. And so they have to know that there's an accountability of weight. And if not, then you're kind of penalized with a pound or two that the odds will drop on the racehorse if you don't make weight, right? So that's the game.
So I
And
was actually quite interested in this, because when I think about Scorpio,
mhm,
um, I think about the extremities, like even a Scorp rising, like it's that, generally someone's going to be very, let's say, very tall or is something very extreme or very petite. And so with you being a horse jockey, my assumption is that you're petite. I've never actually seen you in face to face,
I'm
but
kind of I'm kind of tall for a jockey. I'm petite in uh I'm not petite in that I'm fairy or waif-like. I'm pretty sturdy. I'm very curvy in stature now. And even then, I was 5'6" as a jockey, which is tall. So if you're riding at an average of 111 to 118 pounds, fully clothed with helmet and equipment, you have to be very slight in weight, which for me was underweight, and for almost 95% of the jockey colony, they all have to really monitor weight, and it ends up in eating disorders or kidney failure for some, using diuretics to waste water, um, and either being anorexic or bulimic to maintain weight. You can't fully hydrate on a hot day of races in between each race because water weighs weight, right? So you're always thirsty, you're always a little bit cranky. Um, there are some people that live that easier than others. But I was not in a very happy state when I had to starve myself and not fully hydrate. You don't feel well. If it's 108 degrees outside and you're, you know, putting out a lot of physical effort to get a horse across a finish line and you're underhydrated, you don't feel well physically. I mean, yes, is it part of the unfortunately, it's part of how it works to make that weight you if you want to ride horses. Hopefully that will change in some capacity. I don't know how, but it's a very unhealthy way mentally, physically, and emotionally to have to live your life.
so then, during this time when horses were still everything that you thought about,
Yeah.
did you take any sort of support from I guess, the horses that you got to be with? Was there like an intuitive connection between you and the horses?
For many, I think my big disappointment with horse racing is that it wasn't once I got into the industry, it really wasn't an industry that loved horses. It was it was to make money. And I was blindsided by that part of the business until I really got into it and saw how it wasn't an industry that truly loved horses for being horses. It was a money-making factory, and I started to get very disillusioned and jaded by that because my first priority was the welfare and the happiness and connection with horses.
Huh. Um,
So, does that does that answer part of that?
no, it does. It does. Um, did you experience any significant experiences or stories with horse racing that you can tie strikingly to that 12th house Scorpio stellium?
I think the secrets. I think that what we just discussed about keeping secrets, there are a lot of illegal maneuverings that go on within the industry. There are a lot of uh, affairs that happen. There's a lot of underhanded, dark things. I've always kind of said horse racing's a bit of a bipolar business because you have the wealth and the owners on the front side of the racetrack enjoying, being fully dressed and enjoying the celebratory aspect of the industry and a lot of money. And on the backside of the racetrack, it's its own society where people are addicted to the highs and the lows of the industry. So it's very kind of bipolar in the extremity of winning the races, betting on the races. There's a lot of consumption of alcohol and drugs, and it's it's a little bit of a polarity to the front side of the glamour of what horse racing looks like in the news.
What's your ideal moment, your ideal event being with horses? So
With
it's
horses and now it's very different than it ever was. For me, I grew up being very competitive very early on, and it offered me a container to learn sportsmanship and integrity and camaraderie. My Scorpio nature was inhibited my competitive edge because I self sacrificed and I turned all of the failure in on myself. And it became an unhappy place for me to be that competitive. Learning for me with horses to be competitive and be happy was a lifetime pursuit, to not take it so seriously that I didn't feel the responsibility of the failure. And that I think is very scorpionic.
Mm,
And so the ideal for me now is to not compete with horses at all. For me, my ideal is riding horses out on a trail ride with nature in the least constraint possible where everybody's enjoying, and that it's not so much a competitive, conquering, controlling environment. I mean, yes, do you have to be safe with horses? Absolutely. And without the experience of learning how to control them in the capacity that I grew up with, which was about power, control, and intimidation, yeah. But at a certain point, yes, I understood that's how it needed to be implemented for my safety, but it wasn't about domination for me. It was about connection. And a lot of how I moved through the world in the competitive industry was about domination and not connection. And for me, it's now purely about connection. I don't want anything that has to do with dominating an animal in any capacity.
That's such a Scorp like thing. Well, that's what I kind of think of in some like domination,
Power
control,
and control.
power.
Yeah, power and control.
So
And
it's very
yeah,
incredible to see that kind of flip of someone who, was very much in that sort of space, but how now has switched into connection. So if you could share about that and maybe where intuition comes into all of that.
intuition comes to the place of letting go of any of the power and control,
Mhm.
um, and allowing them to communicate with me. Being open, not allowing the animal to communicate with me, but me creating the space and the openness to receive the communication in its purest form from a horse or a dog or a cat, which I do perceive and communicate with. But it truly wasn't a pure frequency for me, or a more continual frequency, until I wasn't trying to dominate or control an animal in that capacity.
Mhm.
So, and that's all shifted in the last 10 years for me. I The horse industry for me was very much about my conditioning, and collectively what was being done in the horse industry at the time and what was contemporary with those training techniques. There are multiple incredible horsemen and women out there today training horses through connection instead of domination. And that I wholeheartedly support. It's just that for me, it doesn't, that's not where my growth is any longer, through the connection with horses. I enjoy them through the connection of the horses that I'm involved with, which, I have one client left that I've worked with for 12 years, and I know her horses very well, and they are my responsibility for as long as they are alive, and I honor that, and it keeps me connected to the horses that I can enjoy and I trust, because I know what went into working with those animals for the last 12 years. And I know it's my work, and I trust that, and I value that, and I enjoy that, and I love them all the more for that connection that that's created. And so that's the purest essence that I enjoy now. And I think that's what I wholeheartedly and intuitively wanted my entire life. But through the container of the competitive and dominance, I couldn't truly uh, feel that. It's not that I didn't have wonderful relationships at the racetrack or with horses that I've worked with through the years. I absolutely did and connected, but it wasn't until the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years where I didn't have any interest in controlling them in any capacity, where I have open communication with them. We have dialogues that are different than I ever experienced before. And that's that intuitive connection. And it's an allowance. It's an allowance of me being open to that perception and not feel crazy, right? So another one of the catalysts in that Scorpio stellium is that the modality of it is fixed in nature, which makes the stance very firm, and change is not particularly easy for that fixed modality. So Aquarius, Scorpio, Leo, and Taurus are all very fixed in nature, and they're they're not mutable like Pisces is, that is flexible and adaptable and go with the flow. They're not. They're very firm in their stance, and it can create a lot of perseverance on the bright side, and on the shadow side it can create a lot of will and stubbornness and unwillingness to change anything. And I definitely have experienced that in my life.
That's so it was just so lovely to hear you speak about like all of that. It felt like there was this like this gorgeous union between when you were speaking about dominance versus connection. And it felt like it was a symbol for maybe, and maybe I'm reading into things, but the way that you were working with your own self, you know, the dominance of the drugs, and then it becomes connection. And it's like you're that horse who just wants to be free.
Well, every experience we have is really a spiritual mirror if we allow it to be. If we're open to the perception that everything we move through in our reality can be can have kind of a spiritual meaning. I mean, we attach every meaning to every experience or identity that we label, right? So, yes. So the answer is yes. It becomes very much a mirror of my own experience. Wholeheartedly. It's you're not reading into anything. I think that's absolutely what has taken place.
Can you speak about, I heard this in another interview, but you were in, it's like a stall with a horse. So you know what I'm referring to?
The starting gate or the paddock where the
I don't
horses are
know.
tacked up.
I don't know, but it was a situation where it could have been very dangerous, but for whatever reason, with that beautiful Jupiter kind of vibes you've got going on in your chart, you seem to be protected.
Oh, yes, I know what you're speaking of. It was an experience that was I was in on a horse getting ready to break out of the starting gate, and the horse flipped over in the starting gate with me underneath it in the starting gate. So there were like 10 horses ready to break for a race. It's very, it's a lot of power at once, right? And in that moment, there was something that happened that was like an intuitive intelligence that my body knew that I had no conscious awareness of it putting into action that saved my life. I remember nothing of the event other than the fact that a 1,000 pound animal flipped over with great velocity under great stress, and I walked away unscathed when I should have died.
Yeah, out
And
about
that my body took care of itself. It knew exactly where to put itself to walk away without a scratch. And there were people obviously around that shook their head and said, "You should not have survived that. We're not sure how you walked away without a scratch on your face."
how did you, and how do you, and tell me if they're different. Um, how did you make sense of things like this happening in your life? Because it sounds like this is just one of many experiences that have been oddly
I
dicey.
think Yeah, I think those kind of experiences are the ones that you can't explain, that open your perception out of the box of the logical, that there is the capacity for a different kind of intelligence and support, universal support, that we are not privy to if we're only in our logical mind and don't believe in the power outside of that limited container. And some people call it spiritual awakening. Some people identify it with their religion as, that they were blessed by whoever is protecting them, in however that is. And there's no judgment in any way coming from me. My, my belief system is not religiously oriented, but do I believe there is a power greater than myself that protects me in some way? Yeah, I do.
Hmm.
And for me, that is that intuitive connection. It is the synchronicities. It is the butterflies and the hummingbirds and the number 1111 and all those little synchronicities that can be downplayed by people that don't connect to that. That's okay. They don't have to believe in that, but for me, those little moments of magic are what help me feel connected to the universe outside of my own human experience, that helps me stay connected and be in service to others to be connected in that way with themselves, because for me that's magical. That's the magic that living my soul's purpose is.
Soul's purpose coaching.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's funny, I've had people kind of say to me, wow, you just kind of called it for what it is. Yeah, I mean, I love the nuances of interpreting some kind of exotic name where people are like, "Oh, that's cool. What does that mean?" I like that. I like that. But for this instance, whatever inclination I had when I came up with Soul's Purpose Coaching, I just wanted to call it what it was so nobody had to guess what it was.
Mm. Very blunt. Very,
Yeah,
very
well, that's
saggy.
also very Scorpio.
Quirky.
Scorpio, Sag, yeah, very
Very.
matter of fact.
Um, okay. Having multiple personal planets, and like points, like you said, ascendant, Lilith, in one area of the chart, what does that tell someone about who they are?
How I understand it in my own story is that it was a chosen frequency that I needed to learn to master. And when I say that, I believe in reincarnation, and I believe that the karmic story will predicate our soul agreement the next time we incarnate in a human experience, and that some past karmic stories, past frequencies, really helped me design that I needed to get a handle on that Scorpio frequency in a big way. Like there's a giant saturation of understanding the life and death process, the secrets, the regeneration, the regeneratrix of that Scorpio frequency that is part of my life purpose for me to master. And so for how I see a stellium is a frequency that needs to be mastered in a saturated depth. So it's not just one aspect in Scorpio. It's not just the Scorpio sun in the 12th house. It's 5 planets plus Lilith plus my ascendant. Apparently, I needed to become expert in that. And that's how I, number one, keep my sense of humor about it, because it can get really dark if I let it. And it's not so much spiritual bypassing as it is just keeping the humor in what life serves up sometimes that can be really challenging. And how am I going to navigate that for my highest good without it ruining me?
Okay, so then are there any like practical steps that you use in your life to keep yourself from getting like super bogged down by the weight of, stellium
Yeah,
in a
I think it's finding balance. I think it's the commitment to both feet in my own life, which means where am I distracting? Where do I need to hone structure? I'm not naturally a very structured person. I do my best work when I don't plan things, and then things just are either channeled or they are in conversation or they are very impromptu. um that is when I feel the best about what I put out in the world. And when I overly control the dynamic, whether it's me dominating myself in a structured capacity, which is a lot of how I thought I had to do things in order to be successful, um I've let that dissipate. I've let that, but when I say that, it doesn't mean that I'm not disciplined. It just means that I do it differently than probably how most people imagine structure. And I'm continually honing what it is that I need to work on and what's out of balance. Like my kitchen needs to be really deep cleaned. Not that, you know, because and I'm not an expert at folding my laundry and putting it away. Does that make me a failure as a person? No, but it's a lack of judgment that I've released of myself that I thought in the first half of my life that made me a failure.
Mm,
Does that make sense?
it does. It really, really does. You're a very unique person, as you already know. But
Mars and Aquarius.
okay, Mars and Aquarius. Boom. Um, and I was just I guess I was getting kind of like lost in a good way in what you were like sharing. It I had
I have the I have the ability to go multi-tangential, so if I didn't answer your question, bring it back to center and I'll try again.
oh, you did.
Okay. Okay.
I'm also, you know,
Yeah.
so I'm always trying to just figure out, where I'm going, you know. Um, but okay. I had an experience in meditation that I wanted to share with you.
Please.
Um, It happened a few months ago, and I was sitting on a horse. This is before I knew anything about you. I was
Okay.
sitting on a horse, and I think I was wearing like white and green or something, and I felt like I was a horse jockey. I wasn't moving. It
Mhm.
felt like, those images where, photography, they take a picture, but it's from the perspective of the person who's doing the thing. So
Yeah.
that's
So
like
you
what
were
it,
on the horse and that was the image that you had. Yeah.
yeah, like I was as if my eyes had been cameras and they'd just taken a picture. And I saw this beautiful, like the neck of the horse, and it was just this nice, deep, rich brown color. And
Mhm.
I saw the sort of light brown of the ground. And it felt like I was maybe on a track or some sort of course. And I was with the reins. And the reason at the time this stood out to me was because it just felt so real. And I've had experiences about my past lives before, but this felt a little bit different. So I don't know if I don't know if it was just something I kind of created to communicate with myself, you know? Um, but something that is discussed in the path that I follow is, and it's funny because it connects to what you were saying about self-sovereignty. Um, the whole idea is that it's like you're on a chariot, and the horse represents the senses, the eyes, the taste, the smell, the touch. And the aim is to always stay balanced and centered as the soul who
Yeah.
is in control of these sense organs so that everything can work well. And
That's
so
what I call that's what I call your earth suit, right?
my
So
earth,
your earth suit is the chariot
my earth suit is the chariot. And I just
and your
wanted to share
soul
that.
and your soul is an infinite energy. And I absolutely love that. And I also have the intuitive inclination to share that you experienced that perhaps in connection with me. That at the time that you experienced it, you didn't know me, and here we are. And I'm not sure if you have any other connections to people that have been in the horse racing industry, but for me, that's very much a synchronicity. That's very much the soul's communication to say, wow, you're going to come up. You either have in the past experienced some horse racing energy, or it's coming up
Mm,
on a different timeline. So that's fun. That's curiosity. That allows the intuitive intelligence to hold a little bit more weight than linear thinking in a way.
radio. Um, yeah, so I was just so that's very cool. I appreciate that. So for
Thank
me,
you. Thanks
yes.
for sharing that. That's really, especially with how organic it felt.
Oh, well, yeah. it was just a surprise, and I appreciate what you shared too, that that sort of connection to you, you know. Um
It's possible. We'll never know definitively unless you intuitively know, because that claircognizance can be, you know, because you know, but you don't know how you know. You just know. And you don't need the evidence to prove it because you just know,
mm, mm,
right? So that's one of the clairs taught in intuitive strengthening or intuitive awareness, is you just know because you know
mm,
without knowing how you know.
mm. And I appreciate that also, what you're speaking about timeline, because, you know, I definitely, you know, I feel like the way that time moves is that it's cyclical, and so like what you're saying about either it comes from the future or from the past, that very
Mhm.
much resonates because it can be, you know, both at one time.